Welcome to Exposure Controls. In this section, we're going to take a look at all the controls, functions, and options for making sure that you get the correct and proper exposure. There's a lot of options in here, so we're going to take a good look through all that you have available to you. All right, now before we really dive into this section, I just want to remind you that the still and movie switch on the back of the camera is really important that you have it set in the correct position. We're currently talking about still photography, which is kind of the general shooting menu on the camera. And so you want to make sure that you have the camera in the stills mode, not the movie shooting mode. And if you don't have it in the right place, nothing's going to make sense in here. So make sure that you have it in the stills mode for this section. All right. The mode button on the top of the camera is designed like a lot of the latest Canon cameras. It's a mode button and dial. It's got a little bit more versatile options and functions than you can have with a traditional mode dial that had the little icons on it. So you press the mode button, you turn any one of the dials that you want to change the exposure mode that you are in. So we've got a lot of different modes to talk about. We're going to start with the easiest of the modes, which is the program auto exposure mode. If you were going to have to hand the camera to somebody who didn't know how to operate a camera or this camera and you wanted to keep it as simple as possible, this is the mode that I would probably put it in. What's going on in this mode is that the camera is setting shutter speeds and apertures for you. And that's it. That's all it does. And so you'll need to set up your ISO separately. You could put that in auto ISO or any particular setting that you want. That's up to you. But this is just controlling shutter speeds and apertures. Now you can see those shutter speeds and apertures if you look through the viewfinder at the bottom left of the screen. There'll be some information along the bottom panel and you'll see your shutter speeds and apertures down there. You'll also see them on the back panel of the camera if you are holding the camera away from your face. Now, you can do something very handy in here called program shift, and this will be done by turning the front dial of the camera. What it does is it maintains a proper exposure but changes your combination of shutter speeds and apertures. So if you don't like the combination that the camera is giving you, then you can change it. Now, the combination that the camera is giving you is generally based on the fact that it wants to give you a shutter speed fast enough so that you can handhold the camera. It doesn't know if you're on a tripod, and if you want to use a slower shutter speed, well, then you can dial that in. It also doesn't like to give you too extreme of settings, so if you do want to change it to something more extreme, you can simply turn that front dial, main dial, for program shift. Now, the back dial is automatically used for exposure compensation. So if you want to make your image a little bit brighter or a little bit darker, what the camera does is it adjusts the shutter speed and apertures that it's automatically in control of to make your images a little lighter or a little darker. So those are two very important controls that you can use in the program mode. So exposure compensation can be really handy on subjects that are either lighter or darker than normal, or you have a particular preference on how bright they come out. And so exposure compensation will also be useful in the time value mode and the aperture value mode, but works real well here in the program mode. So let me go ahead and give you a little show and tell on this particular feature here. So what we're going to do is we're going to press the mode button on the top of our camera, and you can see that we have a bunch of options, and we can just cycle through those different options till we get to the program mode. We can press the shutter release, or we can press the mode button and we're back there. I want to see what's on screen right now, so I'm going to press the info button, and we can adjust our zoom here. And you can see that the camera is giving us a pretty good exposure. And if we pan over to where it's a little bit darker, it might adjust that exposure. We can see our numbers down here in the bottom left of the screen, and they change ever so slightly as we go from a lighter to a darker situation. Now, I happen to have the camera just set at ISO 1600 for working here in the studio. If I wanted a slower shutter speed, I could dial this down and we could get as far as 1/25 of a second. If I wanted a faster shutter speed, I could dial up to the maximum aperture on this lens and get to 1/640. And so that is our program shift with our top dial on the camera. Now we can turn the back dial to do exposure compensation, and you can see how that lightens and darkens the image And we can see that down here on our exposure compensation scale down here. Now I'll talk more about this in the class, but the metering is over here on the right side and the exposure compensation is on the bottom side. And we're actually changing both in this particular case. So program mode is very easy and simple. And if you want to keep things, well, as fuss-free as possible, then that's a good mode to use. Next up, let's talk about time value. So clearly here, time is the more important value. This is what you get to set by selecting shutter speeds with the main dial of the camera. This would be good if you know that you have fast action and you want a fast shutter speed, like 1,000th of a second, to stop the motion of a subject. You could throw it in time value. The camera is going to work by changing the aperture to give you the correct exposure. You want a longer shutter speed, you can do that. Now, the time value mode is not one of my favorite modes, and that is because, well, there's a lot of times you can overrun what is really available, and you need to be very aware of the aperture if it is blinking at you in the viewfinder or on the monitor on the back of the camera. This is letting you know that the camera does not have an aperture appropriate for that particular situation. The back dial will also be used for exposure compensation like we talked about in the program mode, but let me show you this little issue with the time value mode that you need to be aware of. I still use it from time to time, but you do have to be careful with it. All right, so let's press the mode button and we're going to change to the time value mode. We're going to set that in. And right now I still have ISO 1600 set and the camera is set at 1/80th of a second at f13. All right, that's fine. Let's say I wanted a faster shutter speed. All right, so let's dial up to a faster shutter speed. And we can get up to 1/800th of a second, but let's just say I wanted 1/2000th of a second. Well, the camera does not have an aperture wide enough for that. And so it blinks at you. And if I want to take a photo, it's not going to stop me. It's going to play back this image. And we can see it's a very dark image. And so you do need to be aware of the blinking aperture, which indicates that you either need to change your shutter speed back down to a range where it stops blinking, or you'll need to change your ISO to something different to accommodate for that change. And so be aware of that when you are using that mode. A good option for that, and I know this is jumping ahead just a step, but I know a lot of you know what I'm going to talk about here, and that is auto ISO. And so we're going to talk about ISO in just a moment, but auto ISO can kind of come in and save the day for you when you are using the time value mode. You can use time value, and if you do run into an area where you are setting too fast a shutter speed, the camera will just bump the ISO up when and where necessary. So that's a good option for those of you that do like this mode and don't want to run into that particular problem. Next up is one of my personal favorite modes, which is aperture value or aperture priority. This is where you get to set the aperture and the camera will work with the shutter speed to give you the correct exposure. You can set a small aperture like f22, which gives you great depth of field, or a wide aperture like 1.4 to give you a very shallow depth of field. Now we don't have that same problem that we had in the time value mode because there are so many more options for shutter speeds than there are apertures. Typically a lens will have about 8 or so apertures, but many cameras will have anywhere from 17 upwards of 20 different shutter speeds that they can go to. So there's just a lot of options in here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the aperture priority mode on this camera. Press the mode button in, and we'll turn this to aperture value. Now currently the aperture is at f8, and I'm at 200th of a second. If I turn the main dial on the camera, I can stop it down to f22, and we happen to be at 1/25th of a second, 1/25. And if we go to the maximum aperture at f4, we go up to 1/640th. There's no blinking. And so anytime you see blinking is a warning there's potentially a problem there. And right now, the entire range of the camera, of this lens I should say, is perfectly fine. The camera has shutter speeds that can handle that particular aperture. And so it's very quick if you are in a diverse situation where you're shooting a little of this and a little of that, and you want to make your adjustments very quickly. This mode works quite well in many, many situations. All right, next up, let's talk about flexible value. Now, if there were aliens from another planet and they had cameras, this is the mode that they might have. This is kind of a new and completely different way of operating a camera. It is actually a little like Fuji, for those of you that know Fuji. The idea here is that you have kind of free control of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and exposure compensation. And for the first three of those, you can kind of jump in at any time and say, I want you to be automatic and I want you to be manual and you to be manual as well, or automatic and I want to switch it out anytime I want. Normally you would have to go, oh, okay, well, I want to be in the program mode. Well, now I'm going to switch to the time value mode. Well, here you just control those individual functions of the camera. So the way this is going to work is once you're in the flexible value mode, is you will turn the quick control dial to that top right rear dial to select the feature that you want to change, and then you can use the main dial to change that particular setting. And if you want to throw it into automatic, you hit the garbage can button, because they don't have an automatic button. I guess the garbage can button is not being used for anything else, so it's a good one for this. Now, if you want to set all of them to auto, you can just hold that garbage can button in, and then they are all turned into automatic. And I know this probably sounds a little confusing if you're only listening to me, so let's go ahead and do a little demonstration on how this would work. All right, let's press the mode button. We're going to dial over to flexible value here. And now you will notice on the bottom screen here, time value is auto, aperture value is auto, exposure compensation is in the middle, and ISO is in auto. So we've got the little orange indicator here that indicates if we turn the back dial, get my meter turned on, we can do exposure compensation. And it just kind of, the camera is going to work with a little bit of everything. You can see the shutter speeds and apertures all changing a little bit depending on where the settings are. All right, let's say I wanted to lock in ISO at 100. Well, I would dial across. So now that I have kind of control of the ISO, I can turn this dial and it's now at 100. So now it's going to, adjust the light here, it's going to change shutter speeds and apertures according to whatever is going on, but it's locked in ISO to 100. Let's say I want to go to time and I want to lock that in at, let's just say 60th of a second here. All right, well, right now we don't have an aperture big enough, wide enough to let in enough light. So I'm going to go over to the ISO and I'm going to bump our ISO up to 1600. And right now, the camera is just going to simply choose whatever aperture it needs. And so it's kind of in a shutter priority mode right now. But if I want to set a specific aperture of, let's say, f8, well, let's go to 5.6, and you can see that it is a little on the bright side here. So let's go back over to time value, set a faster shutter speed, and get this set here. Now maybe we want to go to aperture, or actually let's go to shutter speed and put this down in auto by pressing the garbage can button down here. And I may have held that for just a little too long because it sent everything into a full auto mode. So let me get this reset here. So if I just want to get time value into automatic, I'll press the garbage can button and their time value is now automatic. So this is a little confusing to people who have never used this before. But if you give this some time, this could be the one mode you use for photography for everything all going forward, because you have everything available to you: program, shutter priority, aperture priority, full manual, all with some very easy button pressing that's very quick to get around and allows you to work around certain situations. And so if you've been around photography for a while and you're just not too sure about it, I say just give it a chance. Take a day where it's not too important of material that you're shooting and play around with this and see if you like it. It may take a day or two for you to really get used to it and see if it's something that you want to work with, because I think this has a lot of potential and it kind of frees up a lot of thinking in how you work around your settings on the camera. So give it a try. You might just like it. All right, next up. is manual. Definitely one of my favorite modes in here. This is where you get to select everything yourself. Shutter speeds and apertures. ISOs is still kind of set separately, so you are setting that manually as well in this case. Now you'll see your shutter speeds and apertures down there along the bottom. You're going to need to use the exposure indicator to make sure that you're getting the right exposure. And what I like about manual exposure is consistent results. A lot of times photographers will pick a subject and we will shoot several photos on that particular subject over a short period of time while the light is not changing dramatically. And we want to get consistent results no matter how we compose our pictures, what the background is. We want nice even lighting on all of our photos. And so once you figure out the lighting, you can shoot even exposures. Manual exposure is also really good under tricky lighting conditions, either things that might be really dark or really bright, or things that might just fool the light meter of the camera in some way. And so in those situations, manual exposure is going to give you consistent results under unusual circumstances. Now, for those of you who are new to a full grip camera, the 1D style camera from Canon, if you're coming up from a R5, R6, if you're coming up from, say, a 5D Mark IV in the SLR world, well, the 1 series cameras from Canon work a little bit differently, and they've mixed this camera with a number of features from a number of different preceding cameras. And one of the things that's a little bit different is that the exposure information is not down there along the bottom information of the screen. That is the exposure compensation. Now that's the way it was in many other Canon cameras, but what's new here or different for some people is the exposure indicator over on the right-hand side. This has been very common with 1 series cameras from Canon in the past, but this might be new for some people. Your exposure indicator is over here, and it's considered a vertical exposure indicator. There's not a lot of numbers or anything else on it. It's pretty clean in its design. Unfortunately, it is overlapping on top of the subjects, the image area. And if you don't like this, you can turn it off, and I'll show you how to do that later on in this class. Now, if you want, you can turn that vertical exposure meter off, and it reverts back down to there to the bottom middle where the exposure compensation is, and that becomes your horizontal exposure indicator, and it works more like a R5 or other traditional base level Canon camera. Now, if you do want to jump in and get this changed, you can go into Shoot menu number 9 under Shooting Info Display, and you can turn on and off the vertical exposure level. But we're going to leave it on right now because it does help us separate and get a little bit more information than we could get just down there at the bottom of the screen. So we have a vertical indicator, and obviously the upper side is the plus or overexposure, and the lower part of it is the underexposure side. So it's very intuitive, and I like that. All right, we have third stops and 1 stop increments, so you'll know if you're 1 stop overexposed or 1 2/3 stops overexposed. If you go too far, you're going to get an arrow, which indicates that you are more than 3 stops either over or underexposed. And of course, baseline, most of the time you're going to want to try to get that exposure indicator towards the middle, at least to see if that's the right exposure. You'll need to adjust from there as necessary. And so that's how you're going to set up your manual exposure. So let's go ahead and do this real world in here and show you anything else I can find out about this. Okay, so let's put our camera in the manual exposure mode. Right there. All right. Now, by the screen, I'm looking a little dark, and by the vertical exposure indicator over on the right, I'm looking to be exactly 2 stops underexposed. So I can choose to fix that with ISO, aperture, or shutter speed, and I'm just going to make it easy and go with shutter speed. And as I adjust this in third stop increments, I can get the correct exposure. Now this is what is technically considered correct. I know that my little focusing target here is a little bit lighter than average. That white cabinet is very bright white, and it might be overexposed by maybe 1/3 or 2/3 of a stop. And so if I wanted the proper exposure in this case, I would actually set it here to get a proper exposure. And that's because there's a lot on this particular image that is very bright, and you can see that by that histogram there. I've collected virtually all that information. It's tapered off to nothing on either edge. And so if you're good at studying histograms, you'll know that's a decent histogram. And so the exposure indicator is over on the right. You notice down here on the bottom that the exposure compensation has disappeared down here at the bottom because we're not using it in the manual mode. If we were in the aperture priority mode, then we would have our exposure compensation down here, and you can see the exposure over on the right-hand side going up and down. And so having both of those there does prove to be beneficial in a number of areas that you'll see as we continue throughout this class. All right, next up is bulb. This is a manual mode for long time exposures. This is good when you want to leave the shutter open for a long period of time, like a minute or 5 minutes, say, in this case, to capture all the streaked lights of the cars on the freeway. Now, in order to do this, you put the camera in the bulb mode and you press down on the shutter release to open or trigger the shutter, and then it stays open as long as your finger is on the shutter release. And then when you release it, well, then it turns it off. Now, actually pressing down on the shutter release of the camera is not a good technique. You probably want to be using one of the remotes that are available for this. And so the exact timing of how long it stays open can either be your finger on the button, or you can dive into Shoot menu number 7 under Bulb Timer, and you can set it up for a particular amount of time. 43 seconds, 20 minutes, whatever number you want to dial in there, the camera will then turn it off for you. So it's a built-in timer and you don't need anything extra. If you want to be a little bit more spontaneous, let's say you're shooting fireworks and you want to keep it open for 5 or 10 seconds or 20, it depends on the situation. Well, that's where one of the cable releases or remotes would be very handy so that you can start and finish on your own whim whenever you want to. So any of these remotes would be a good option for doing that type of photography. All right, next up is the custom modes. So we have custom 1, 2, and 3, and currently they have a little P down there beside them because they are by default set to a program mode, but you get to go in and change this. The idea is that you might have different things you like to shoot and you like to have the camera set to different exposure modes and set up in a different way for different types of subjects. And you can preset your camera to a particular setting, and then you can lock that in with C1, C2, or C3. So you can kind of have your secret recipe set up under these 3 settings and quickly get to them by dialing 1, 2, and 3. Now, the way that you do this is you A, set the camera up the way that you want it to, and then B, go to setup menu number 5, custom shooting mode, and you register those settings into the camera. So let's go ahead and give this a little try right now. All right, so just for reference, our camera's in the manual mode right now, and what we want to do is set up a particular mode. And I'm going to go into, let's call it travel mode. Aperture value, I want to set an aperture of 5.6. I want an ISO of, let's say, 400, and let's just call it good at that. All right, we're not going to make too many changes. We could go in and make changes with the drive settings and the autofocus and the metering and other things, but we're just going to call it good at this. All right, so aperture 5.6, ISO 400. So we're going to go into setup menu number 5 under custom shoot mode, and we're going to register these settings, and we're going to register them to number 1. All right, and we're going to lock this in. It's going to take a moment, and we're good. All right, so now let's go ahead and let's change our camera back into the manual mode. Let's change our ISO down to 100. Let's just change our shutter speed so we're getting a reasonable exposure right now. And let's say we're just taking photos and we decide, you know what, we want to go to our travel mode. What I'm going to do is press the mode button and come over here to C1, which you can see has AV. That's the made setting in there, is its aperture value. I'll set that up, and the camera has automatically switched to ISO 400, 5.6, and it's in aperture value, and I can shoot my photo, and it's set up perfectly. And so this is really handy when you quickly want to change from one mode to the next. And so once again, the way you do this is just set the camera up the way you like it, then go up to setup menu number 5, custom shooting mode, and register those settings as 1, 2, or 3. And the nice thing is that it will do a lot more than I showed you. As I say, if you want to go into the menu system and start making adjustments to various settings in there, you can have your camera set up for a lot of different types of photography, very easy to get to. The main thing I think that's important to remember here is try to find 3 things that you do on a regular basis. You know, if you are constantly shooting a particular sport all the time, you could set one of these up to that sport. If you work in a particular room or environment that requires a unique white balance and setting in the camera, and you get tired of making all those changes when you go to that room or that scenario, you can get it changed over to that particular one. So something for you to play with, something for you to experiment with. So those are your exposure modes. Now, I don't expect anyone to use all of these modes. I would encourage you to give them a try, see which ones you like. Most people usually settle on 2 or 3 favorite ones that they come back to on a regular basis. If you find that there are some in here that you never use, you think are dumb, you don't even want to see them in the options, you don't want to accidentally set your camera to them, you can go into custom function number 2, restrict shooting modes, and you can eliminate these from the option list when you press down on the mode button. So let's just say you find flexible value really goofy. You uncheck the box for that particular feature and it doesn't show up when you press the mode button. And so you can just simplify things down to exactly what you use on the camera. All right, next up, let's talk about ISO. Now, there is a number of ways of controlling and setting your ISO, as there are a number of other features on this camera as well, just a number of ways to get to it. The first way is through the multifunction button on the top of the camera. Now, for a long time, Canon has had an ISO button right up there near the shutter release, and I found that to be a great feature because I change the ISO on a somewhat regular basis, and it's easy to get to, and it's really obvious. Well, Canon said, you know, that's good that you can change the ISO, but what if we could change a few other things with the same button? And so they've added 5 functions, up to 5, I should say, that you can have programmed into this particular mode. Now, if you don't like these other functions, there's a couple of things you can do. And the first thing is just don't change it to anything else, and it's always going to be your ISO button. So when you press that button, you can either hit the quick control dial 2 on the back of the camera to change which function you're selecting, and then you can use the main dial to change that particular function on this. So if you leave it in the ISO mode and then you just press the button, change your ISO and go back to shooting photos, well, it's going to stay in the ISO mode and it's always going to be there when you press the button back. Now, as far as the ISO 100 is the native sensitivity of this sensor, which means if you want the greatest dynamic range, the greatest detail, the least amount of noise, you want to shoot at ISO 100. There are slight compromises when you go to the next settings on the list. You can go down to the low setting. It's going to lose you a little bit of dynamic range. It's great with noise, but it loses you a little bit of dynamic range, and you don't want to do it unless you are really desperate for that particular ISO setting. We'll go up to 204,000 in its high setting. Let's take a look at some samples of images that I've shot with all the different ISO settings. So we do need to blow this up pretty large to see the difference. Now, everything on this first page up through ISO 1600 is really very clean. This camera is very good at low light ability. As we dive into the higher numbers here, I think the camera is still incredibly clean at 6400, and I could see it being very useful for many people up to 12,800. We are starting to reach certain compromises, and different people are going to have their own levels of limits on how far they want to push this ISO. But I suspect with many people that number is going to be somewhere between 6,400 and 25,600, depending on the final use of the particular photo. And so let me show you a little bit more about this multifunction button and how to use it in the ISO mode here. Okay, so the multifunction button here on the top of the camera, when we press it, it starts off with the ISO setting, and if we want to change the ISO setting, we can do that. If we want to exit, we can press the shutter release down on it. By pressing the multifunction button, it allows you to switch between the different modes, or you can turn the dial in the back of the camera, or the other dial in the back of the camera. So if you want to change the drive settings, you can do that here. If that's where you leave it, press down on the shutter release halfway, and then you press the multifunction button again, it goes back to where you left off, which in this case is the drive mode. So if you want to leave it in the ISO mode as standard, just go in, make your changes. Let's dive up to 800 here, press down on the shutter release, and we're knocked out of it. And we go back in by pressing the multifunction button again, and press down on the shutter release to escape. And so there's a couple of different ways of advancing to the next function in there. You can either press the multifunction button, or you can turn either of the back dials on the camera. So once you get used to those controls, it becomes pretty intuitive and pretty quick and easy to work with. Now there are more controls that you can have with ISO, some subtle changes that you can make to the way it handles ISO. What is the top ISO it will use? What's the minimum shutter speed? We'll talk more about that when we get into the menu setting later on in this class. But if you want to dive in, that is in shoot menu number 2. All right, continuing the talk on exposure, the metering system is very important for controlling the exposure. Over on the left-hand shoulder of the camera, there's a couple of buttons. The button closer to the back of the camera controls 2 different functions depending on what dial you press. And so when you press that metering button and turn the main dial, you can change the metering mode. The camera has 4 primary metering modes. The first one is the most popular. This is evaluative metering. To be honest with you, this is where most people that I know that shoot Canon leave their cameras virtually 100% of the time. There's 384 zones. It's evaluating the highlights and the shadows and trying to get a good balance for everything. Generally speaking, it does a pretty good job, and most of the time, you won't need to make any adjustment and you're going to get a decent exposure just metering it with evaluative metering. Sometimes you need to bump it up a little bit or bump it down a little bit if your subject is primarily bright or dark, but it does a very good job. Next up is partial metering. Partial metering might be deceptive. It's not partly metering, it's metering a part of the scene. It's not spot, it's not an average, it's kind of between the two. It's 5.9% of the viewfinder. And so if you did want to get the reading off of a central, modestly small area, you could use this one. Now, a little bit more practical for some people is the spot meter. If you do want to get a specific reading over a small area, just 2.9% of the viewfinder, you can use this. So if you have a subject that has a very bright or dark background and you don't want your metering to be thrown off by that other tonality in the image, you can measure a very specific area. It also has a traditional center-weighted average metering. This is what a lot of traditional cameras have. I don't know of really any photographer that uses this on a regular basis, but you might find some cases where you'll like to use it. But generally speaking, the evaluative metering is the most sophisticated metering that is going to give you the best results in the widest range of situations for most people in most shooting. And so you simply just press that button, it stays, the feature stays active for a few seconds, and then you can change that setting with the main dial on the camera. Making sure you have the right exposure, one of the best ways of doing that is with the histogram. And so whether you are live view or playing back in the image, if you want to hit the info button, you can turn on histogram information. This is a graph that shows you the tonal range of what you are shooting. Now you can turn this on and off, and you can control various aspects of it in shoot menu number 9. There's some little customizing that you can do in there. And this will give you a visual graphic display of whether you're underexposed or overexposed, and provides you with good technical information if you are capturing the right range. Now when you're playing back an image, well, you can hit the info button again, and you might get a brightness histogram, or if you hit it again, or the little joystick for more information, you might get an RGB histogram, which will show you the color channels and how bright each of them are, which is what I like, just because it gives you a little bit more information in there about how each of those color channels are dealing with the light in there. And so that is a great tool for checking to make sure that you are either going to or have just taken an exposure that is correct. All right, auto exposure lock. There is a button on the back of the camera with a star, and this is the auto exposure lock button. Now it can also be used for flash exposure lock, but we're not going to talk about flash because that's another piece of equipment in here. So exposure lock allows you to lock the exposure when you move the camera from one scene to the next scene. If you are in one of the automated modes like program, shutter priority, or aperture priority, known as time value and aperture value, and you set up with a subject next to a window, the window might be throwing off the exposure. So you move the camera off to the side, you lock the exposure in, and then you recompose using the locked exposure from the inside, not with the window there. And so that works like it has on many other cameras for many, many years. Now there is kind of a secret mode that I came across, and it is in the instruction manual, but wow, I had to really search for it. It was just like one tiny little line in there. And it can also be useful in the manual mode as a second exposure reading. And I know this sounds kind of weird, but it can be helpful for some people. All right, so we have our vertical exposure meter, and we set up an even exposure. Well, if we press in on the AEL button and we recompose, we can see where our original exposure is and our new exposure is. And so this is just kind of different. I haven't seen any camera do this before. So let me go ahead and show you how this all works. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the camera back into an aperture priority mode. And we're going to just work with our aperture here at f/5.6. We're at a 20th of a second. And you'll notice that if I pan off to the side here, we drop down to a 1/4 of a second because it's a lot darker over there. It's not lit the same as this subject here. And so if we wanted to keep this exposure locked in, we would press the star button and we can move over here and lock that exposure in. All right, so now focus is another issue. So if I lock this in at a 20th of a second, I can shoot at a 20th of a second over there. Whereas if I just point over there, now it's still turned on there, now it's turned off, it goes down to its own shutter speed. Now let's take a look at how this works in manual mode. Okay, so manual mode, I'm going to want to select a proper shutter speed here, and let's just say that this is proper exposure. It's right in the middle here. If I press on the AEL button, you can see the star over here. Now you can see over on the right-hand side that the indicator shows me where my new exposure and my old exposure is, and that this new area is underexposed. I can then adjust for the new area or the old area or something in between. And so we have two different exposures, and you can turn this on and off by pressing the star button. And so you can see this change over here, and if you want to set something in between, you can set it in between so that you're getting an exposure between those two. And so I have a good feeling that this is a feature that is not going to be useful for a large percentage of people, but there's some people that are going to probably find that handy in what they do. So it's a nice little kind of secret feature that's not well known about on this particular camera. All right, next up, exposure bracketing. So exposure bracketing is when you shoot through a series of photos, lighter to darker, to capture a range of brightness. Now there's a number of reasons why you might want to do this. One is you're just not sure what is going to come out being the most useful and practical final image, and so you shoot a darker version and a lighter version along with your normal version. There's also HDR photography, high dynamic range, where you might be shooting through several photos and using all of them together combined with a software program to create one image. In any case, this has a very easy way of getting to it. By pressing both of those buttons on the top left of the camera, you will enter the auto exposure bracketing mode. Now you can get to this also in the menu setting under shoot menu number 2, and you can do the same thing. So it depends on how you want to get there. And then you can set the camera up for how big a bracket you want to do. How big apart do you want your different frames in there? And so you can choose a number of different frames to have this done. And this is very helpful in certain types of landscape photography, real estate photography, where you're dealing with very different exposure levels from inside to outside, or from the shadows to the bright areas. Now I find this most useful in aperture value mode, but it will work in time value as well as the program mode. Now you can control the number of frames it shoots by going into the custom functions and adjusting that setting. You can adjust the increment amounts directly by going into this setting. And you can also use exposure compensation with this as well. And so this can be a very handy tool in tricky lighting situations. So let's go ahead and do a bracket series here. All right, so I'm going to set my camera up into an aperture value mode here, because then I can set a particular aperture. Let's say I want an aperture of f8. I will press down on both buttons, and now I can do an exposure bracket up to 3 stops. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do one that's 2 stops, and I can use either of these dials to control how big the bracket is. So here's a 2-stop bracket. So what's going to happen is it's going to shoot through 3 photos. 1, 2, 3. Let's take a look at these 3 images. I'm going to play it back with just a little information here. So the first image here was the normal image. The next image was -2. And the final one was +2. Now, one of the little tricks that I like to use with this is I like to change the drive to continuous. You can use high speed or low speed. We'll talk more about this particular function a little bit later. But now when I shoot my bracket series, all I'm going to do is I'm going to press down on the shutter release, and I'm just going to stay pressed down, and it's going to fire through all 3 of them as quickly as it can. Here we go. And that way, the 3 pictures are as close together in time as possible. For a landscape photographer, that might be important because the light might be subtly changing right at that moment, or there might be things moving in the frame, and you want to get them as close together as possible. And so using that drive on the high setting, I think, is really good with bracketing, unless you are trying to time something particular that's happening at an irregular pace, perhaps. So this can be very handy when you're just not sure about the correct exposure. All right, the camera also has a high dynamic range mode. Now, previously I talked about bracketing and taking all those images and using an external software program to create a singular image. Well, this is where the camera will do it for you. And as wonderful as a camera as I think this is, the software for doing an HDR image does not have all the same controls and power that one might have on a separate computer. So I can't say that I highly recommend this mode for most people. It might be good for experimenting. You might see if it works for your particular situation. I just don't think it's super powerful in what it can do. But in any case, it has it. Here's how it works. In shoot menu number 2, there's an HDR mode, and there's a bunch of features in there that you can adjust. The first one is adjusting the dynamic range. And this is basically the bracket series. How wide a bracket do you want to capture to create an image? You can do 1 stop, 2 stop. I think usually 2 or 3 stop is going to be where you see the biggest difference in what you collect out of this. You can also set it to auto, where the camera will just decide what it needs. And you can see in this example here where I was exposed for the highlights on the top, and with the shadows on the bottom, using the +3 setting allowed the camera a greater dynamic range. It held the highlights back a little bit, and it boosted the shadow tones a little bit more. And so 2 or 3, if you do want to use this, is my recommendation. Now, if you are going to be using this on a monitor that has limited brightness, you could limit it to 1,000 nits. How much is a nit? Well, it's 1 candela. How much is that? Well, it's the amount of light that a candle emits over 1 square meter. And so if you could have a meter around a candle, it's how much light. Just for reference, a movie theater is around 50 nits because it's reflected light and they keep it really dark in there. And it's hard to project a lot of light. A mobile phone might have 300 to 400 nits, and a TV or monitor might have 1,000, 2,000, or 4,000 nits. And that's why you might need to limit it if you are going to be showing your images on a particular monitor that has limitations. Most people don't need to worry about this. All right, continuous HDR. Are you going to be doing this for 1 shot, or are you going to be doing this a whole bunch of the time? And what this is basically describing is, do you want this feature turned off after you use it 1 time? And if it's something you're just experimenting with, then 1 shot only. If you've got a whole series of things that you're doing with it, then you leave it on every shot, and that way you don't have to come in and turn it on again and again and again. Auto align image. You do not want this turned on if you are using a tripod, because your camera should be aligned and it's not being moved from one shot to the next. A key thing about HDR is that you're taking multiple images and combining them, which means things can't move around. If they move, they're not going to be lined up properly. If you are handheld with the camera, then you would want to enable this. It's not the best way of shooting HDR, but it's possible and you can do it. And if you're going to be handheld, you can't keep the camera handheld in the same position for 2 shots. It's impossible, or at least really, 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 really hard. So then you would leave this on enable. What it does is it crops in, you lose a little bit of frames, and it combines those images together. Now, you shouldn't be shooting HDR on subjects that move around. There'll be some ghosting. You can have the camera try to fix that ghosting by enabling it or disabling it. To get the best HDR, you should not be shooting something that moves around, and then you can leave this disabled. If you are shooting something that is moving, you might try enabling this to see if it solves the problem. Next up, do you want to save the original source images? Generally, yes. If you are a serious photographer, letting this camera decide the final HDR product for you may or may not work out for what you're doing. If it doesn't work out, wouldn't you like to go back to those original images so that you can work with them in software and get it right in some other program? If you trust the camera and you know what it's doing and you're perfectly fine and you don't want to waste the space of those original images, then you can just choose to keep the HDR image, which is going to be a JPEG. It's not going to be a raw image. And so you do have limitations on what you can change. And so if you're serious about it, yeah, you definitely want to keep that original source of image there. All right, as you can see, lots of stuff to experiment and play with in the exposure controls. I encourage you to try a few of the things that you're not used to, see if you like them, see if they help you get better exposures.